thank you so very much for joining us today. I will be your moderator, aka facilitator, and I'll be the one yelling majority of the time, so bear with me, right? Welcome and thank you. And I want to first say that this is an informative forum, and it's not to endorse either or. It is for them to have an opportunity to talk to you, for you to ask them a question. We have asked the community to give us a question that we can ask them for a good 30 minutes and grill them about policies and visions and missions that they have. So some of the community brought some fabulous questions, and we have our beautiful panel that will go ahead and ask those questions. So the first segment of the event is about question, and they get to answer. And then we also get to ask them a warm-up question, sort of a trivia question about how much they know about us. So I'm going to give you 2 minutes, Joedia, 2 minutes of introduction of each individual, and give us a little bit bio about you.
First, thank you very, very much for being here. My name is Jenny Durkan. I'm running for mayor of Seattle, and I would love to have your support. I said to a few people, I can't tell you how great this is to come in this room and see all these strong women. It is usually you walk into rooms and there aren't as many, in particular lately as I've been meeting with a number of people in the East African community, no offense to my men friends. There doesn't seem to be as many women as there should be, so thank you. I'm running for mayor. I had the good fortune to actually be born in Seattle, raised here, as was my mom. And I'm running mostly because I love the city. I think Seattle is an amazing place, but we have just seen such explosive growth in the last 7 years that it's changing before our eyes, and we need to be very intentional about what kind of city we want to be. I have been, for over the last 30 years, devoted to issues of race and social justice. I started out as a criminal defense lawyer representing people. I am openly gay, so I represented and worked for LGBTQ rights in Olympia and Seattle over the last many decades, whether it was non-discrimination or full marriage equality. And then I had the very good fortune to be appointed as President Obama as his U.S. attorney, and served in the Western District of Washington for President Obama, and worked with Eric Holder in Washington, D.C. on his advisory group, where I spent about a week every 5 weeks. As U.S. attorney, I did a number of things that I think are really important about what we need to do for the future of Seattle. I established a civil rights division, and we went from having almost 0 civil rights cases to today there's over 100. And we enforce the broad range of civil rights, including housing discrimination, police constitutionality, and the like. I work together with a number of community groups, including CARE, thank you very much, to make sure that we could get change in the Seattle Police Department and insist on getting a consent decree. So I was one of the original signers of that and led after a lot of community effort, including many, oops, I've got to stop. So I look forward to working with you in the future and answering your questions.
Hi, it's great to be here. Thanks for hosting this forum. It's great to talk about issues that are important to your community and get to know you better and share a bit more about myself. I am Cary Moon. I am running for mayor of Seattle because I believe in Seattle's potential. We have incredible, diverse population. We have so much wealth in the city, it's hard to believe. We have progressive values, and we have a culture that watches out for one another. But we are not living up to our potential. We are becoming a city of haves and have-nots, where the wealthy few are making a lot of money and pulling ahead, and the rest of us are falling further and further behind. I think we need to tackle these challenges head-on, which is why I decided to run for mayor. I am focused on solutions, and I'm focused on a constructive, positive future vision, because the only way we're going to get to the city that we all know we can be in the future is if we identify what that looks like, and to me that is a city that is inclusive, diverse, creative, committed to shared prosperity for everyone, and affordability. So I am focused on that future vision. I laid out a very concrete set of solutions to the biggest challenges, like public safety, like racial equity, like housing affordability, like how do we build an economy that actually builds family wage jobs and takes care of small business and builds wealth in community. And I am focused on these solutions and refining them and developing them with you. I'm a mom. I'm married to a great architect, and I have 2 kids in their teens and 2 stepkids in their 20s. And really, they are fueling this desire, along with young people throughout the city, to make these big changes that we need. Because we all know Seattle needs to work for everybody. It doesn't now, and I am committed to be there to build that future together. Thanks.
Thank you. Right on. What separates you from your opponent?
So I think my experience. I am an engineer first, and then I studied urban planning, urban design, landscape architecture, and I've been working in this city on these challenges of urban growth for 20 years. So I have worked with so many of the city departments and commissions and committees. I've been on commissions, I've been on advisory committees, so I'm deeply, deeply embedded in and understand how the city works, why we are not solving the problems that we have, and what we need to do to get there. So the experience I have working directly in this city on these challenges with solutions ready to go. And then second, my leadership style. I have been watching why we don't solve problems in this city, and a big challenge that we need to face, that I'm ready to face, are how do we build a mayor's office that's connected through city departments so that we can tap the potential of the excellent 11,000 folks who work for the city who have good ideas ready to go. So how can we have a great management leadership structure that's including them in the decision making, but also working directly with neighborhoods. We used to do a lot better job collaborating with neighborhoods. We need to bring that back. So we need to make the Department of Neighborhoods more effective at connecting with community, more dynamic around listening and centering your ideas, your voice, your view of how do we solve these problems, and make sure that we are investing in community organizations, because the only way we're going to build shared prosperity and shared power in our city is if the city uses its resources to invest in your capacity, in your power to make things happen for yourself. It's been a big problem in our city so far, where we have a lot of wealth flowing around, and it mostly goes to the large nonprofits. It goes to the city contractors that are used to getting the big contracts. We need to do a much more intentional job of focusing on community-based organizations and minority and small business owned by communities of color, because that's how we're going to solve wealth inequality and really share power.
Thank you. Yeah, Jenny?
So I would say that experience does separate the two of us, but the experience is Cary has a lot of great plans. We have very similar plans, but I know how to get those plans done. And if you look at the history of my life, I actually am a person of action and improving people's lives. I'll give you one example. The day that Trump's Muslim ban came down, a lot of people watched on TV, a lot of people complained about it. I got in my car and I drove to SeaTac Airport. And on the way, I called the Northwest Immigrants' Rights Project and the ACLU and said, we need lawyers there. We were able to contact the court and work with the families, and we got the first court order, maybe in the country, but clearly in the Northwest, to stop them from illegally deporting 2 men and just sticking them back on the plane. They had to bring the plane back and those men back. That's the kind of action I will do. When I worked on police reform efforts, I was out in the community at meeting after meeting after meeting, listening to learn what did we need to get done. But listening wasn't enough. We actually had to do it. So we got an agreement, we got the consent decree, and we got a federal judge who now says to the police, you're not done until I say you're done. We couldn't have done that if we just talked about it. So I think the real difference is we can plan and we can have great planning. But if we can't take those plans and actually improve people's lives, it doesn't make any difference. And it's big things to little things. When we had a lot of the meetings about police reform in my offices at U.S. Attorney, everyone has to go through security. Well, I found out early on, for example, that the women coming through, they were going to make them take off their hijabs. And I went down and worked with security and said, we can't do that. It's disrespectful and it's wrong. So we changed the policy. It seemed like a little thing, but it made it a place where people could actually come and help work on the solution. That's me. I'm about action and getting it done.
Thank you. My last question for the time being. Growth is a very contentious issue right now in the city of Seattle. I want to hear each candidate share an example of when they showed leadership in either taking controversial position or bringing people together to find a solution to a controversial issue. So Cary, you're first.
Let's see, around growth, I think there's 2 things I want to talk about. First, in the Pioneer Square neighborhood, there was a lot of community process about how do we add density, add growth to the neighborhood while still preserving the historic character of the neighborhood and not tearing down historic buildings. The community came together, had an agreement with the city, and at the 11th hour, at the last minute, a small group of developers went to city council and said, we want you to write different rules. And they convinced City Council that they should change the rules in order to favor developers, which would have resulted in more historic buildings being torn down. And I stood up with the community, wrote and talked to City Council members and got them to change their mind and go back to the community agreed process, which has been greatly beneficial for Pioneer Square. So that's one example of standing up. Second is on housing affordability. So we have had a crisis of housing affordability in our city that's gotten worse and worse. Our housing prices are now growing faster than any other city by 2 times the rate. We have a problem with outside Wall Street interests buying our housing stock and escalating the prices on purpose because it's a better investment than most other investments you can get on Wall Street in the stock market. And so I took a strong position against speculation by wealthy outside interests who are driving up our housing prices on purpose and put out a platform of solutions that would stop that activity and invest 4 times as much money in affordable housing than we're building right now. Because this is essential. We have got to build housing that's affordable to low-income people and middle-class people, or our city is going to get hollowed out and just be a playground for the wealthy. We can't let that happen. I took a lot of heat from developers and from the people who are profiteering off of housing because they don't like that I called attention to that activity, but I'm standing firm and continuing to push for it because that's what we have to do to keep the city affordable to regular folks.
Thank you.
So, police reform, when I was U.S. Attorney, was probably one of the most difficult and contentious issues in this city at the time. And while we've made great progress, we know we have to make greater progress. But let me talk a little bit how we did pull people together and the stands I had to take. So I was the United States Attorney. My job was to enforce the law. About 1/3 of the cases we had, Seattle Police Department had officers involved. I had to be able to go to the police department and the people in my office and say, what we're seeing is wrong. We saw video after video after video of usually young men in color being abused by the police. And then John T. Williams was shot and killed on a Seattle street. It was clear we had to do more. I had to not only work against the police department and bring them along, I had to fight City Hall because the mayor at that time refused to talk about police reform. And we got closer and closer, and literally we're almost on the eve of filing a lawsuit when we finally got a settlement. And the last point of controversy, the city pushed very hard. They did not want to include anything about bias policing because we as the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice and the U.S. Attorney had not made a specific finding that there was bias policing because the city wasn't collecting the data, so we couldn't prove it. I said no. I've been involved in police reform literally for decades. Anyone who knows anything about it knows there's an issue of bias in policing in this city and every city across the country. I stood tall and said, I will not sign any agreement that is not supervised by the court and does not include bias policing. We finally got that agreement, but we only got it, I think, because I, together with the community, said, no, we have to have that or it won't work.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn it over to the panel. Each segment is 3 minutes. Each question is 3 minutes. You can ask the question to be repeated only one time. You cannot ask for the question to be explained or elaborated on. All right? What do you mean by that?
So I have the first section. My name is Kahima Mohammed, and I'm a part of the Somali community here in Seattle. And so I'm going to be talking about workforce development and economic development. So my first question is to you, Jenny, and then Kelly can go after. What are your plans to expand youth opportunity internships for young people in the city of Seattle?
I love this question. I think, we talk a lot about affordability, and I'm sure there's going to be a question about housing affordability and affordability of Seattle, which is crushing people. But it's the workforce development and the youth that I think are the part that almost are rarely talked about. So I proposed a number of specific things to do on this front because I really believe until we have that path forward for our kids and they know that this city is their city and that they can either be the people who in the future are building the towers or running the companies in the towers, we haven't done right by them. So it has to start literally at good prenatal care. We have to support our moms and support them all throughout. We have to have good early learning programs and good after-school programs. If you look at Seattle, we have one of the worst educational opportunity gaps in the country. Biggest opportunity gap in the country. There's no excuse for that in this city. And it's because we have not done what we need to do with the Family and Education Levy and other tools to make sure that we are focused on getting those kids ready so they can continue through school. And it's a whole host of programs we've had. So I've said I want to use the Family and Education Levy money, which is renewed next year, to focus it on equity, not just equality, to really look at how we can partner with Seattle Public Schools to close that opportunity gap for kids. And then for those kids that do get through, who do graduate from our Seattle Public Schools, I promise that they will get 2 years free tuition at a community college. 2 years free tuition. That will give them opportunities they wouldn't have otherwise. Some will get a certificate and degree, some will go on to a 4-year school, some will go into the trades, some will go into computer programming. We want all those jobs open. And the third piece is, I've said that I will start in implementing more apprenticeship programs earlier. So kids get trained up, whether it's in the trades or whether it's computer programming, and they get real jobs in the summer. Not go to Microsoft, spend 2 weeks, get the swag and you're done, but real jobs for kids. We've got to have that pipeline be a pipeline from school to the next economy, not a pipeline to prison or to poorness or any of that. We absolutely have to have more opportunity for our kids. And that can only happen if we work with neighborhoods and communities. You know, and I know that many of you are involved in childcare. It also means that we give better supports to childcares and parents. You know, there's a lot of obstacles that the state has right now that they place on child care providers. That's a mistake. Those are the people who can help us get kids ready and do it in the community. So I would also have someone in my office who's a liaison to the East African community, but who's also one who's specifically focused on all ranges of education. And how do we use the power of the mayor and the power of the city to break through those barriers that the state sets up?
Thank you. So this is a fantastic question because really this is the heart of the matter. When you look at racial inequity in our city, it is largely due to just gross difference in what resources kids from communities of color have access to versus what kids from wealthier white communities in the North End have access to. And this is really where we need to focus our efforts. So I have committed that throughout the city budgeting process in every single department that we will use a racial and social justice equity lens in how we allocate resources. Because we have to start looking at how do we rebalance the decades of inequity and really start investing in communities of color and South End communities more than we have. And this is the way to do it. We have to make rules at every level of the city to make sure we're doing this. And that includes the Mayor's Summer Job Initiative. It includes all the internship programs that invite kids from all over the city to participate in internships. We've got to make sure we're doing the outreach via community organizations to make sure we are identifying and finding the kids who are ambitious and excited and want to do this. Find those kids and make sure they get matched to a great employer. We need to work with trade unions and make sure the unions who already have great apprenticeship programs are targeting low-income kids, kids from immigrant and refugee families, and communities of color. We've got to just facilitate that as a city. You know, I have kids who are teenagers, and I have to say I have seen this play out again and again, the inequity. You know, the kids who have ambitious parents, whose parents are connected into city government or big corporations, those kids get the great internships. They get the extra head start. They get to go work at the super cool jobs. It's simply not fair, and we've got to recognize that and make sure we are going to community organizations and identifying kids and helping them get that same chance. I also think we need to really focus on using the Family and Education Levy dollars on community-based organizations that can do the culturally competent outreach and services that kids from communities of color and refugee and immigrant families need. And that means really listening to community, working with educators in Seattle public school systems, and finding the programs that are the most effective, that are doing the best work to help kids who need that extra support to get ahead, get into these get the great training they need, get the family services they need, get the health services they need, and make sure that we are focusing on equity and giving kids who need the most resources to get ahead. So all those things together, I think we can make a pretty big shift in how we do this as a city, working with community organizations. Thank you.
Somebody, and how do you go about picking someone to
Great
represent
question.
us?
I would first come to a variety of the community groups and say, talk to me about who do you want, what do we need, and it won't be just one. I mean, I want to have the broadest, most inclusive mayor's office and every city department as I can. And so, but I want to make sure that we can have someone who actually is from and understands and regularly can meet with East African community to know that's always going to be there as a resort.
Thank you.
Are you volunteering?
So my second question is, the city currently funds an equitable development fund initiative that builds capacity and funds projects led by communities of color. Do you support this initiative, and how will you allocate additional resources?
I absolutely support this initiative. It's about time we have this initiative, because this is really how you make change, by investing in capacity in community organizations. So yes, I would expand the program and make sure it's well funded. We need to look at new progressive revenue sources in order to increase the funding for this, and I am ready to do that because it's essential to invest in community. I know the Ethiopian Community Center is doing a project that's stalled out because there's not funding, and I would absolutely focus on that as one of the top few priorities to make sure we do this. I think, you know, I was recently part of a progressive nonprofit that allocated funding to build progressive movement in our state and our city. And what we learned through doing, you know, we did a deep assessment into how do kind of wealthy white philanthropists contribute to the solution or contribute to the problem of wealth inequality and racial inequality in this city. And we undid everything about how we granted money and completely changed our model. So we're investing primarily in community-based organizations to build capacity and community, because this is how we make lasting change. This is how we're going to achieve racial equity. So absolutely, I totally understand how, you know, power held in too few hands has created this problem, and we need to change the way we operate with funding allocation. And we also need to commit, which I promised to do from day one, to sharing power in the mayor's office, in all departmental leadership positions, in all boards and commissions in the city, because we need to have folks at the table who can explain from their own perspective what the solutions look like to them, and we need to start taking that way of operating more seriously in our city, so we're truly sharing power, listening, and building solutions together. So some of the progressive revenue sources I think we need to look at is, you know, we have the most regressive tax system in the country, in our state, and that means the people with the least income pay the highest percentage of their income in taxes compared to wealthy people, 7 times as much. That is simply unjust, it's not fair, and we need to fix that. So I'm proposing both working in the city on what we can around capital gains tax and additional real estate tax for luxury properties, a lot of things that will only affect high-income people, as well as a more steeply progressive capital gains tax where small businesses pay a lot less and large corporations pay a lot more, so that we're getting adequate funding into the system so that we can invest in these kind of solutions you're identifying.
So the short answer is yes, I would fund that program and support it, but I want to turn it around a little bit. So I grew up in a big family. There was 8 kids in my family, big Irish Catholic family. And for a period of time, we couldn't all fit at the dinner table. So we had a little card table my parents set up, which was called the kids' table. And it was really a big thing when you finally got to go from the kids' table to the big table. And so while I support these funds, I think the problem with that is if we are satisfied that that's enough, it's wrong. It's almost like there gets to be a kids' table. And what we have to do instead is reorder how do we prioritize all budgeting in the city and all development. And how are we directing our resources to make sure that we are addressing the deepest inequities we have every part of the system. So we talked about schools a little bit. You know, Seattle mayor does not have control of the schools, but we're a really close partner with the Seattle Public Schools. And the Family and Education Levy is going to give us more money to fund that. The Seattle Family Education Levy as it exists today is inequitable in a number of ways. 1, how it directs the resources, but 2, it judges schools on test scores. And we know that test scores are biased against kids of color in particular. And so we have to reconfigure how that works. And then we have to say is, where do those schools really need the money? How do we help close that achievement gap? How do we work with the schools? And we'll learn that it's better after school care, it's more tutoring, it's those robust employment opportunities from youth that give kids the self-esteem. You know, I was in Rainier Beach talking to them about how the youth violence prevention program is going, and one of the things I heard was more and more youth were applying for the jobs, and they didn't get any. That's wrong, because they not only don't get the opportunities, it crushes their hopes and say we're not open. So while I support that equitable development, I think we have to look at every part of our budget in every division and say, how are we using that to address the deep inequities that exist in our system, from transportation to housing to schools. And so it's not just part of the pie, and it's not the kids' table. Everybody gets to come to the big table.
Hi, my name is Malcolm. I am part of the Durkan community, East African community. My pronouns are she, her. And my questions are on housing. I don't like the word affordability because it's not really affordable, so equitable housing and homelessness. So my first question is, gentrification has negatively impacted communities of color, specifically East African communities. As a result, families have been forced to leave the city due to high costs and just living standards, thereby losing many of their community traditions, cultural hubs, and economic mainstays. As mayor, how do you plan to address this and hold your team accountable to those plans and while you're during your term? And how do you plan to what do you plan to say to white, wealthy communities that feel threatened by this idea?
Yeah, it's your turn.
Okay. This is such a critical part of who we are as Seattle. And we've had a very similar question when we did a forum at the Coalition of Immigrant and Refugees and Communities of Color. And it is something that I try to send this message in every room I'm at, in every part of the city that I'm at. Because if we don't solve these deep inequities now and work on it, we will become a city that we don't recognize and no longer represents our good progressive values. So there's a number of specific things I think we have to do on that. Number one, we have to be honest about the problems and issues. And we need to try to stop displacement as quickly as possible. There's three components to stopping the displacement, I believe. The first is, of course, to build as much affordable housing as we can in every part of the city, not just in the South End, because there simply is not places that people can afford to live in Seattle. So we need to do that, and at the same time, preserve that affordable housing that we have right now. As property taxes go up, landlords raise the rents and people are displaced. Every time the rent goes up $100, data shows more people fall into homelessness. So we have to do more of a city to preserve existing affordable housing, also as we're building affordable housing. And we can do that through a number of things. One of the things I proposed is I want to go to the landlords who are giving affordable housing and say, if you keep your rents down, we'll lower your property taxes. But if you raise the rents, property taxes go up and you got to pay back the break you got. Creative things like that. The other thing that I've proposed and no one else has proposed is we can't wait. We can't wait for this housing to be built because it's going to take 3 and 5 years by the time you get the property, build it. So I've proposed a rent voucher system that I will put in place, starting to put in place in the first weeks of office. You know, we even analyzed what it will cost and what we can do. There's over 340 people on the waiting list of Seattle Housing Authority. It's a service that has always traditionally served immigrant and refugee communities in Seattle, but people wait for years. We would clear that list with rent vouchers in the first weeks of my administration, and then we would expand it to people who were not yet qualifying for SHA help, but still needed the help. Because what's deemed affordable in the city isn't affordable, because it's all pegged to an income number that is only reserved for the very wealthy and the people who moved here for Amazon. So those are some specific things I would do.
So this is really what motivated me to enter the mayor's race, because I'm so frustrated with the lack of action and the collaboration between developers who are making a healthy profit right now in the mayor's office, not addressing this issue adequately. So I have so many friends who have been forced to leave the city, friends who have moved 2 or 3 times in the past 2 years because their rent keeps rising. I have friends who are stuck because their rent is rising, but they can't save enough money to move, and so they can't afford to move and they can't afford to stay. This is a crisis, and I know it's affecting your community more than almost any other because we absolutely have to just build more affordable housing. So I am working really closely with a lot of experts in this field on how do we do equitable transit-oriented development. So how do we make sure that we are building new housing with community, for community, near transit stations? Because transit and housing costs, are tied closely together. If you go move to Kent to chase affordable housing, then you're stuck with increasing transportation costs and all this time you're spending away from family. So you didn't really solve the problem because your costs are still right where they were. So we have to build transit for community, with community around housing around transit stops. And a couple good examples to point to are El Centro de la Raza. They built this great center that has affordable housing, that has community space, that has childcare, that has social services, education services, and community gathering spaces, spaces for artists and small businesses, all together around the transit station. That is a model that we need to copy. And the way they did that was community groups, developers, nonprofits, philanthropy, and the city all partnering together around shared goals and talking and establishing what would actually benefit the community, not the condition we have now where whoever has the most money gets to make all the decisions. So we need to do community benefit agreements. I'm involved in a project called Artist Coalition for Equitable Development, which is a new organization of a lot of hip hop artists and young African American artists who are frustrated at what's going on at 23rd and Jackson. And they have put together a proposal for what they want from Vulcan. And what they want is they want affordable housing, they want affordable space for arts production, they want space for small and local businesses from the community, and they've put this proposal to Vulcan to say, please come to the table with us, you need to be a good player, you need to be a good citizen of this city, we need to figure out this development together. And I would support that effort. El Centro de la Raza, Southeast Opportunity Center, there's a lot of good models, Liberty Bank, we need to keep doing this more and more throughout the South End.
Can I just follow up to both of you? Just 30 seconds each, I guess. On what exactly is your mechanism of accountability to ensure that those things are happening for yourself and for the team that you have?
We set aggressive goals and people have to report back. I think you hire really good people, you charge them with their vision and what they have to do, but then they have to come back, and if they're not meeting the targets, then you double the efforts. But I've been involved in large organizations, and you have to have very robust ways to make sure people are moving forward, otherwise it doesn't happen.
So I say the city can be the convener that gets the community benefit agreement crafted and signed, and then the city can use its power to make sure it's enforcing it. And I think ongoing dialogue with the community has to be built into that. So the community has to have a way to check in with the city on, is this going the way we promised? Is this going the way we planned? How are we dealing with the unforeseen questions and problems that come up? So we have to establish community dialogue as part of the accountability.
Thank you so much. My next question is, Black and brown people are disproportionately represented in our city's homeless assistance or services. What will you do to ensure that the city policies, programs, and funding decisions have an effective, equitable approach?
So I think, again, this is deep in the practices and the procedures and the policies of the city. We have to make a commitment from the top that we believe in racial equity and racial justice. These are the principles we're looking for. These are the metrics that we'll measure this by, and then we have to make sure that is being applied at every single level of government, all the way down to the outreach teams that are helping with homelessness services. I've spent some time with Chief Seattle Club, which focuses on the Native American population, and I think the same thing has happened in your community, is that the city simply just doesn't adequately fund community-based organizations for communities of color to do any kind of outreach work. And we just need to change the way we're investing in outreach and social services, working with communities of color, and making sure we are shifting our funding towards those organizations that are doing this culturally competent work in community. So I'm, in the homelessness issue, you're right, it's heartbreaking. And the number of kids who are homeless, the number of people under the age of 30 who are homeless is heartbreaking. And we absolutely have to get ahead of this challenge. And this is one of the areas where my opponent and I differ the most. I believe we need to focus on shelters that meet people where they are, low barrier shelters. So if you have a pet, if you have a partner, you can come inside and have a shelter that meets your needs. We need to focus on tiny house villages and sanctioned encampments for the people who are chronically homeless, to help them get to a kind of an interim space, learn how to be in society again, learn how to live in a community again before they move on to long-term supportive housing or regular affordable housing. So I think we need to really invest in temporary emergency shelter to get people with a secure place to sleep, a roof over their head, a place to keep their belongings, a place to stay with community, and then take the next step to help them get into affordable housing, get social services, get job training that they need. We need to do investment in these low barrier shelters and temporary solutions before we do sweeps, before we go in and clear out an encampment. Because when you clear out an unsanctioned encampment, people sleeping on the side of the highway, you are throwing their life further into chaos if you don't offer them a new place to come. So I would, yes, focus on helping people who are in an unsafe place get out of that ASAP, whether it's in a park or on the side of a highway, but not move around any unsanctioned encampments until we have a place to invite people to stay inside that's safe and that meets their needs.
So first, I just want to clarify, because I think Cary elliptically got to it, but we don't disagree on the need for more emergency shelter. In fact, I have made specific proposals how we get there. I have proposed that we have emergency shelters in every council district, because everyone has to share in the solution. And I would suggest that we go to community centers, and you can have 300 to 500 people sheltered. And if that doesn't work for a particular council district, then they have to identify, is it a place of faith? Is it another community? Is it a nonprofit? But each district has to do it. The other thing I have proposed is, and within the first year that I'm mayor, we will site and construct 1,000 micro houses, or tiny houses that are insulated, hopefully have electricity, plumbing, and some kind of facility available. Because we need more short-term shelter immediately. We don't have enough right now. And that's why so many people are living on the streets, in RVs, in tents, and the like. So we need more short-term emergency shelter. But your question was a little bit different, which is, why are there so many people of color disproportionately represented in the homeless community, and what will you do to solve that? And the answer is, if we only look at solving it in the homeless community, or people who are experiencing homelessness, we won't solve it at all. We need to pull the camera back, and we have to admit, there are more people of color who are also burdened by the opportunity gap. More kids of color are expelled and detained. And the criminal justice system disproportionately has more people of color in it who come into the jail and then are discharged, sometimes directly into homelessness. So if we don't look at the systems holistically and provide more opportunity for youth, and make sure that we're keeping kids in schools, that when they run into trouble, we have those interventions and credible messengers who can work with the kids to say, hey, here's how I did it, here's what happened to me, here's what you can do. That we don't have credible job programs and training programs. We've got to start and have prevention all the way at that level. Then we have to look at the criminal justice system, and I've been fighting for reforms in the criminal justice system literally for decades. As a criminal defense lawyer, I tried to fight the criminal justice solution to the war on drugs. I tried to get, some treatment and a public health response instead. We finally got drug courts, and it wasn't enough. We're in the middle of another public health crisis. It's called the opiate crisis. And if we don't have a public health response instead of a criminal justice response, we'll be in trouble. So we have to have more resources to homelessness, but we've got to have more prevention so people don't fall into homelessness.
Thank you.
Okay, my name is Maria Tegla, and I am Seattleite. I originally was born in Richmond, so I represent the Richmond community here. So I'm going to ask a question around affordability and homelessness, and then my second one will be on education. So as a white, financially secure woman, how will you acknowledge and put aside your privilege to allow those most impacted by housing insecurity, homelessness, and food insecurities to lead the policy efforts?
Did everyone hear the question? It's a great question, because I get it a lot. It's like, how can we trust you to do this? How can we trust you? And so I think first I will say is, to know what a person will do, you look at what they have done already. Because words really are easy. So I will point to my record that literally over decades, I have been working with communities of color and disadvantaged communities to try to lift people up. I've been working with LGBTQ communities, largely because I am, and it helped my family, but knowing and understanding as a criminal defense lawyer what was happening to families every time someone was prosecuted for a crime instead of getting that public health need. And as I was U.S. Attorney, I learned that as a prosecutor and federal prosecutor, even though I've been a criminal defense lawyer, it's very different when you're the person on the street that the police are pulling over. When I get pulled over by police, it's a completely different experience than probably anybody in this room. And what goes through my mind is not what goes through your mind, which sometimes is fear, insecurity, and the like. So the only way you can do that, coming from the point I have, the privileges I've had over my life, is to engage people, to listen, to understand. How do we move forward? What is it that would make it better for you? What is it that you're feeling and experiencing? We are right now in the middle of a very difficult but very important conversation in the nation, which is who has a place here? And how are we going to make sure that everyone has a place here? We feel like we've been having that conversation over and over again, but we're at this palpable turning point because we have a president who is as much the antithesis of Barack Obama as you can have. A man who led us with hope and the empowerment of people, and now a man who says that the racists in Charlottesville are good people. So we have to reject that, and how we do that as a city is we come together, we're not afraid to listen, and we're not afraid to say, look, tell me what you hear, and I can't be hurt by it, because I've had advantages that other people haven't had. And to know and honestly face it and say, look, this is how we can do better. So the number one thing you have to do is be willing to admit that you've had that privilege and that you aren't in those people's shoes. Second is to listen, and then the third is to draw on life experiences, because at the end of the day, what people want is a chance for kids mostly and themselves also. They want to have a shot at what everyone else has had a shot at.
I love this question because this really gets to the key issue in Seattle. I not only want to acknowledge my privilege, I want to use my privilege. I recognize that as someone who grew up in a middle-class family, you know, an able-bodied white person who had an engineering degree, I know practically every door's been open to me. Every now and then I'll feel the sting of injustice or a door slammed in my face, but it's not very often. Mostly, I get to move through society freely. People trust me, they respect me, they treat me with dignity, and I know that that is not shared by everybody. So I am very motivated by public service. I have spent the last 3 years of my life 100% committed to the well-being of this city. I have used my talent and my expertise and my own money to invest in change, to invest in solutions to these very problems. So I have worked on a big project statewide and citywide to get money out of politics, because I know that is the key corroding factor of why we are not implementing real solutions in our city. It's because of the influence and access that money buys into politics. So I have worked on solutions to get money out of politics. I have worked on solutions to how do we build an economy that actually builds wealth in community via small business, the kind of wealth that stays in community, by working with national and statewide organizations in defining a new progressive vision for what an economy that really builds power and wealth for everybody looks like. I have done some deep training and deep personal analysis into racial equity, really understanding why well-meaning white liberals are actually part of the problem in this city, and that we have to have true power sharing across race and class and age and culture and gender if we're actually going to make change in how we operate as a city. So I've spent the last 3 years of my life focused on solutions to exactly this problem, and I am ready to use my privilege and all the resources that I've accumulated through my lucky life towards solving these problems. Because when I look at young people, when I look at communities of color, when I look at my kids and their friends, I am angry and ashamed at the world we are leaving. It's time to change this now.
And at this time, I'm going to actually skip the question on education. The audience members have questions, so we'll have their minds together.
Hi everyone, it's great to meet you all. My name is Gurmai. I am part of the Ethiopian community here. We are spending $210 million of taxpayer dollars on the new juvenile detention center, which prioritizes criminalizing our children. The data shows that incarceration is ineffective for rehabilitation and as well as deterrence. What is your stance on the new juvenile detention center, and what policies would you support to reintegrate children into society rather than the criminal justice system?
So I was one of the people who misunderstood what the youth jail was when they sold it to the voters in 2012. They lied. They said it was a family justice center. They said it was focused on restoration and diversion and helping kids. We learned after, or maybe you knew all along, that's never what it was. It was a jail for kids. And once I realized that, I was late to the party, but 2-3 years ago I realized that, and I've supported and helped with the No Youth Jail campaign. And I believe we need to invest in diversion programs for youth, we need to invest in restorative justice, peace circles, but most importantly, we need to invest in community leaders who are doing this work already. There are a lot of organizations that are doing heroic, amazing work towards helping youth get back on track, and they are severely underfunded. They are working with barely any resources at all. We know this is the right approach. We know this is what we need to invest in. So the city needs to work closely with the county to make sure we are getting enough funding into those programs and supporting this good work. Because what you've said is so true, that when kids get off on the wrong track and end up incarcerated, end up in the system at a young age, it is practically impossible to get back out. We need to invest in kids. We need to give kids the chance with the right culturally based mentorship programs, with the right services, whatever they need, we need to help them get back on track. So I would do everything I can to continue to reduce the number of cells in the youth jail down to the minimum number, just the number you need for people in psychotic breakdown who really are a danger to society. Maybe that's 5 or 10, I don't know what the number is, but the minimum number, and really reorient that facility towards true restorative justice. And that means both the facility itself, but it mostly means the services and ongoing resources for those activities that we know work. I think this is a larger question around police reform in the city, and I could talk a little bit about that in my minute, but I am really committed to not only continuing to implement the consent decree, but really going deeper, because we know that for the police department to make lasting change, we have to inspire them to be part of it. We have to inspire them to want to be the least violent, most skillful police force in America. And that means working on continuing training around racial justice, not just one training, but ongoing training, because it's a deep challenge that requires a deep shift. We need to focus on management and leadership within the police department so that the precinct level leaders, as well as up on high, all are committed to this change. I'll stop. There's more to say, but I'll stop.
Thank you. I think it's a great question, and I'm going to distinguish a little bit between the facility itself and what happens in the facility. Because I'm on record and agree, I believe the facility that exists now needs to come down. I think it is a horrible place. I've represented kids there years ago, and it was terrible then. It's become a better facility because half of it's now used for the intervention services through the FERS program, which have been very successful. But it's still horrible. I know someone whose kid was detained in the last few weeks who went in and was beaten in the first week. We need to do better by kids. So one is, I think we need a new facility. I absolutely do. But what's in that facility is absolutely the right question. We have to move from a model that we think detention and criminal justice solutions will ever work for our kids. I spent just part of yesterday talking to people from Team Child to say, what are some real solutions we have to detention, even predisposition? Because what happens is when kids are arrested and detained, kids who come from whiter, wealthier families or more, quote, stable families, they can be out in a very short period of time. The kids that aren't, so they are detained. We need more solutions so there's somewhere other than that to detain kids. Sometimes kids can't go home because part of what's happening at home is the problem. So we have to be able to address that. The solutions are holistic, working with the families before the kids ever get in that situation. And then when they get in that situation, working with the kids, working with the families, having those real restorative services. it should be really the exception that kids ever are detained and face what's the equivalent of a trial. That should be the most difficult, violent cases, and even those cases, if we got into the kids sooner, we can do that. So again, I think it goes back, how much time do we have?
A minute.
A minute? I think it goes back to that, the real solution is not, what do we do when they get to the building? We gotta work on never letting them get to the building. We gotta have programs that support moms, support the care providers, support the kids from the time that they are very, very little to the time they get through high school, and then give them that opportunity with free two years of college. The real solution to this is making sure that we have a just and equitable system. And then the last few minutes just on police reform is, we worked very hard on police reform and saw from the community groups that we had to have a cultural shift. And that's why I insisted on a culture based on de-escalation training and crisis intervention, which is now the model for the initiative statewide. It's an ongoing process. It never stops. Reform has to be constant.
My name is Sana. I'm part of the Air Training community. I go to a private Catholic school because the public schools in our community aren't really that good and they're failing. So what can you guys do to make those public schools be better?
That's correct.
Cary first and then Jenny.
Oh, 1 minute please? Okay, so you are absolutely right, and it is so frustrating, it's heartbreaking. I believe the city needs to partner with every other city in this state and our delegation in Olympia to make sure we get full funding for public schools, because that is the root cause of the problem. But in the meantime, until we get full funding, the city needs to do everything it can to use the family and education levy and use the school levy to invest in the schools that are struggling the most. And I think the South End schools, you nailed it, they're the ones struggling the most. They have the least resources. So we need to make sure we're allocating money from family and education levy towards the South End schools, working with community, working with educators on what programs work the best.
Thank you for that question. And it's great to hear from kids because that tells us how bad we're doing. If you recognize that we're not doing well, then we've got to do better. So our number one tool we have is what Cary Moon is, the Family and Education Levy. And that's money that we vote on in Seattle and Seattle gets to control. So how will we use that? That's up for re-election next year. We need to start as soon as the new mayor comes in, and if it's me, I want to have deep community engagement to go into schools with kids, educators, parents, and say what's working and what's not working. So that when we come to renew it, we know we can start from the first day to spend that money right, so that the schools here do not fail kids like you, and you can go to them and be happy.
All right, Pavan.
Hi, my name is Kodan, and I am Somali. Okay, I'm just going to start. If you know/think that the climate is changing, how much of that would you attribute to human activity? All of it, none of it, or some of it? And what are you going to do about it?
Climate is changing, it's human behavior, it's science. And so it's really interesting. This issue hardly gets any discussion, even though it's one of the ones that literally could face the termination of the earth. So I propose a number of things. I'm supported by a number of leading environmental leaders across the city. I want to do a number of things. Number one, I think we need to electrify start over. So for Seattle, we've got to do two things. One, continue to lead nationally and move on the green economy. We have been a national leader, but we've withdrawn from that. We need to do better. In Seattle itself, all the greenhouse gases, the majority of the ones that come from inefficient businesses and from transportation. We need to get people out of single occupancy vehicles by getting people on bus and transit, and we need electric vehicles, and I'll tell you more later.
So absolutely human caused, and we have got to own it. The wealthy, high consumption countries are the places that created this problem, and we have to take the leadership role much stronger than we are now in solving this problem. So I would definitely take the lead of Alliance for Jobs and Clean Energy and Got Green and really focus on the impacts on communities of color, environmental justice, and making sure that whatever revenue we raise through a carbon tax or whatever the mechanism is invested into creating more resilient communities and communities of color who are often the most impacted by climate change. So we have to focus on resilience, We have to focus on building a green energy economy where the jobs go to the people most impacted and work together on it.
Okay, there's, hold on, right, the gentleman right behind you had a question?
My name is Iman. I'm from East Africa. I'm very concerned by the way in which the city involves community. It involves people like myself who can tell you only about observed needs. You cannot tell you about felt needs. So people who are actually being gentrified, being suffering a lot of things, should be able to come to the table and be able to express their needs. Are you willing to change this?
Absolutely. We've got to do it both in continuing, if I'm mayor, I'm going to continue to have meetings like this, but where you talk to me and I just listen. Then we're going to bring people in positions throughout the government to make sure that we are intentional in each of those things, because the voices of the people who have suffered the most under our economic system are heard the least. They're represented the least in City Hall and in the mayor's office and all throughout government. So we have to change that dynamic, because we will never advance this city to be a more just city unless we do that both in a systematic way, but also in continuing to get out into the communities and listening to people about not just what the problems are, but what they think the solutions are.
So yes, and a few things I want to talk about to get there. First, we need to do more community-based planning where folks come to the table and we as community and as city talk together about how to achieve our growth goals together, where you express your ideas, you express what it is you need to thrive, and the city meets you and we figure this out together. I'm committed to doing that. I'm committed to making sure that leadership in the city is connected to community, and I'm going to show that with my transition team. I've set up a 4-person beginning of a transition team to talk about the structure of the mayor's office. But when I populate the transition team, I will come back to you and ask community leaders from your community to help me on the transition team to make sure you're represented inside city government.
So there was 2 more hands and then we're gonna come to you, okay?
I'll take that.
My name is Faven, and I'm a part of the Eritrean community. Our children are bilingual speakers and often not represented in schools, positions that impact decision-making and or governing office. What can you do to ensure that the interest of the East African community is taken into account when making hiring decisions?
So I think you're exactly right. This gap between what's going on in families at home and what's going on with kids at school has got to be bridged, because it is the source of so much misunderstanding and conflict, and it's on the city and the school system to provide that service. So I think we need to focus on funding the community-based organizations that can be the bridge builder, that can do the family outreach and connect families, schools, and kids, and make sure everybody's on the same page. And we also need to make sure that in our city staff, we are hiring folks from community who have cultural competence, who understand, who have connections to community, who know who leaders are, who know how to get information out, and I would commit to doing that as mayor.
That's a great question. We have to do better in a lot of ways. I agree with Cary on a lot of it. We've got to get more people in every part of government that can reflect that experience in the community that there are. But we also have to be intentional about things that seem small but are big, like language access. We don't do a very good job in this city of having, language access on buses and the like. So the people who aren't bilingual, particularly elderly people who have come from East Africa, we're seeing a gap, the bilingual gap. Sometimes the youth are bilingual, but the elders aren't. And so we really need to bridge that gap. And one of the ways we do it is to support things like the Ethiopian Community Center to be able to build its housing so that it keeps a presence in the community and there's more connection with the youth. So I think we have to do all of those things, and it's still not enough.
So then we're gonna go, can I skip you for a second? We're gonna go here.
Oh, okay. So I got 2 questions for you guys. I don't know.
You get one.
Okay. I'll just try to summarize it into one. So if you guys get elected, so how can we make you guys accountable for what you guys have promised? For example, Jenny, you talked about tuition for community colleges. Also, how can you guys make especially the rainier streets safer? Especially, I know the crime rates have recently dropped a little bit comparatively from previous years, but there's still some stuff going on. But how can you make sure that the streets are still safe? Thank you.
I think you snuck in 2 questions, but
I know.
Good job. So number 1, accountability is you've got to be held accountable as a mayor and for your promises, and that means you got to keep going out and hearing from people. And when you fall short, it's up to you all to hold me accountable and say, Jenny, you were down here before the election. We haven't seen you since. Where are you? Because lots of candidates, they just come before the election and you never see them again until 3 years later when they want to run for re-election. So second part about Rainier, it absolutely have to do more safety. We need better pedestrian access, we need better bicycling, that above the street level transit. We knew that was going to be a problem when it was put in, and they didn't listen to the community to make it safer. So we have to go back now and look at how do we make that safe. That's part of equity. That's part of the burden that's been placed on South Seattle that we need to continue to talk about.
So for your second question before I start, was it about the traffic safety, pedestrian safety, or was it about gun safety? And violence?
Both.
Safety and all.
Safety and all, both.
So that's a lot of questions. So first, accountability. So I think, we have gotten so far away from transparency and accountability in the current mayor's office, the current administration, we forgot what we're capable of. So I promise that I will lay out a vision of what we're aiming for and an action plan for how we're going to get there. And that action plan will include specific initiatives, metrics for how we're going to evaluate progress, reporting back, and I will bring that to you and show you what we're doing and ask for your feedback. How are we doing? Are we achieving goals that we promised to achieve? I promise to do that. City government owes that to the residents of the city. Second, yes, there's a lot we could be doing on Rainier Ave traffic-wise to make it safe. There is a set of principles called Vision Zero around increasing safety on the streets. I'm absolutely committed to that, and Rainier Avenue is the first place I'll start. And violence is worsening, not getting better, and we need to deal with that too. We'll get to that later.
All right, we're gonna go here. So, and it is my duty as a candidate and a community leader along with you ladies to merge our influences together. So my question to you, when you are mayor, the next woman mayor, which one of you are gonna open up the birther room that will be free to you in honor of the other woman mayor who was the mayor 100 years ago, so that we can have open, honest, unlimited conversation with government, corporations, rich and poor, all come to that room once a week and show it on City Channel so that we can all be able to deliver what it is that you're really promising us. The only way to deliver what you're promising is to open up birther room so all people can have an equal opportunity to the decisions that are being made in the city, and especially the people who, are really being affected by it. That's how you'll really implement change. You sound good, you really want change. Which one of you are going to help us stop the fascism that is going on in Seattle today by the one-sided party that we call the Nazi Social Democratic Mafia, to stop the Nazi Gestapo principles that are punishing people for restoring their freedom of speech, the Constitution, and equality?
Thank you. Question. Good. All right.
So, I totally support the idea of transparency and citizens having the right to express their point of view and their feedback to government. Absolutely stand up for that. It is a basic American principle. How we do it, we need to negotiate, we need to figure out what's the right process, but I absolutely believe we need to stand up for that. I would like, though, you to be careful with use of the word Nazi and fascism.
It's just an example of the behavior.
Okay.
Anything that's one-sided
let's
is
not
fascism,
conflate.
and that's been used
response.
back in the Nazi era. And so it's just used as an expression of the behavior that is being done by the one-sided party that's suffocating the rest of the community.
Thank you.
I would like to make
respond, but
Yeah.
not directly.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I would like to make sure that we are upholding the right to the city, which is maybe not a legal right, but it is a political right and a moral right that every citizen, every person who lives in this city deserves to help shape the future of our city together. And this kind of dialogue is absolutely essential to make that happen.
Go ahead.
This is your city, so we need to have as many times and places as possible for your voice to be heard. And whether it's in the birther room on a regular basis where people get together, that's a good idea. But coming down to community centers like that, if you're mayor, that's just as important. So you don't have to get on a bus, you don't have to get on a rail, you don't have to come from out. We come to you. This is your city, so if I'm your mayor, that's what I promise I will do.
I see him. So 30 seconds, you guys, 30-second question.
She did a minute, so.
No, 30 seconds.
Thank you both of you for being here. So I'm going to take the privilege of curving a new word. I'm a bureau activist. I'm an activist at heart, but I'm a bureaucrat for living. So just to be very specific on the homelessness, 54 deaths, which mostly were Native American and African American men, to be specifically. I am a black woman in Seattle for the past 22 years who happens to inherit a Somali heritage. So that's one. I am the only manager in King County that manages the homelessness system. So the question, so this is, I'm getting there. Hold on. You're both speaking to my bureaucracy, which is really needed, and that's why I became part of it, to really have change. So our children are no longer gunned down in the streets. So our family are not evicted. So to me, this is to the core of my work. I am a mother of 2 black men. I am the mother of 3 black daughters. I am a citizen of this country where I'm not allowed to come back to my home, when even in employment, there's people that do not look like me, either Latina, African, East African, or whatever it is. So what I am trying to hear both of you say, it's good. But what I want to know is this: how are you bringing ethics and equity into the mayor's office? Because right now, we have had a mayor, hold on, we have had a mayor that has, okay, I'm going to leave that. We have had a mayor that has, so how do you bring equity that is not led by white fragility or white guilt? How do you bring integrity of what is being said here? Because we happen to be East African, but we're black every day.
Thank you. That was a long question, but go for it.
I'll start. First of all, yes, you are exactly right. We have had white fragility, this liberal white Seattle that pats itself on the back and thinks that because we have good hearts that everything we do is fine and good. We are refusing to look at the terrible impacts, the opportunity gap in schools, the fact that black young men and young women do not feel safe when they go outside. We absolutely have to get this discussion on the table, and white people have got to learn to listen to leaders from community of color who know the solutions, been working on this for decades. It's time for us to share power, listen to you, and let you guide the solutions. I'm absolutely committed to that, and I will hold myself accountable by asking you to hold me accountable, by being transparent and being open and working together with you.
You can sit. Fantastic question. There's 2 parts of it.
And what's really nice in your airport.
That's right.
I'm going to hold that.
2 parts. One is, you're absolutely right that we have to do this from a point of inclusiveness and let the voices who have not been heard lead, and let the people who have the experience lead. But I will also say another point is, it doesn't start when I become mayor. You know, we talk about using your white privilege. I've had it my whole life, and I've tried to use it my whole life. You know, I have worked on issues that affected communities of color my whole professional life, representing people as a criminal defense lawyer and trying to get alternatives to incarceration, establishing a civil rights unit where we would actually have secret shoppers go in to an apartment complex and have a white couple, a mixed couple, and an African American or Muslim couple. Guess who got the apartment? And then we do enforcement. So I will lead, I will continue to do it, I will learn how to do it better. But we have to include people, and we have to continue to take what we have, our voice, to those communities, the white communities who haven't listened and don't want to listen.